Like and subscribe.
Perhaps we can start with just a basic question. What percentage of workers were actually Indigenous who worked on the ArriveCan app?
That's a very, very good question, and it's one that I'm not actually able to answer, Jamie. It's something that should be directed to Minister Haidu.
The answer is actually zero, unfortunately. Minister, with the settlements that your department has finalized, in particular, I can talk about the $40 billion for child welfare that was recently worked out through the courts and otherwise. $20 billion is specifically for compensation. Could you briefly explain to this committee what safeguards are in place to ensure that there are no non-Indigenous people looking to potentially access this compensation specifically meant for those victims?
Again, Jamie, I will not be able to answer that question. That's something that should be directed to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Services Canada.
So your department isn't at least preparing some kind of safeguards that might be able to work with other departments to ensure that there are actually Indigenous peoples, the victims, that are getting this money?
I can speak about other settlements in the context of child welfare. It's not something I'm able to answer.
Okay. Now, what about, we can talk about some potential other settlements that have been made, but I'm guessing your answer is going to be the same?
Well, no, I think I can speak about a number of other settlements. If something like McLean, I can answer. There's others that we're part of. So it depends on what the situation is.
Well, I think the broader context is that we have seen through the ArriveCan scandal that there were supposed to be Indigenous peoples that were able to get some work from this and potentially businesses that were able to benefit. That unfortunately was not the case. I do have concerns based on what happened through the pandemic and CERB, the fraud that took place there. My concern now is that the victims that have waited way too long for the settlement might have to compete with non-Indigenous people that might see this large number and want to access some of it. So I was hoping that your department, given the fact that was involved somewhat in these settlements, that you would have the ability to at least put forward some kind of suggestions on safeguards to ensure that the money is going to the proper place, which is the victims.
Look, I think that there are a number of settlements that we're involved with on an ongoing basis, and we have processes for that. So if there's a specific example that you want me to speak about, I can elaborate on that. But to your broader question about representation is something that I'm very much in tune to. So even as we are now looking at future settlements that involve settlements administrators and council, this is a live conversation that I'm having with our department right now. I will note that very recently one of our colleagues wrote to me, Lori wrote to me about a very specific incident and issues around settlement, and there are definitely issues that we're looking at, but from a notion of representation, it is very critical to the work that we do, and whether it's on the administration side, whether it's legal counsel and legal representation, it's very important that we have Indigenous people who are very much part and parcel of those decisions that are made.
Okay. Thank you.
And it's something that we're very committed
to. Thank you. Let's quickly jump over to C-53. It's a piece of legislation that had bit of a bumpy ride through committee, hearing from arguments for and against it. Of course, now Métis Nation of Saskatchewan has broken away and is going to pursue their own path. Perhaps, I guess my criticism was that what became evident was that I know you came in halfway through, you were kind of made minister as this process was already ongoing. I guess my concern, or I guess my critique was, it became very clear and very obvious that the government did not do its homework on this and ensure that proper consultation was done before that legislation was brought forward.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the committee for the work on C-53. I know it was a very long study. The recognition of Métis rights is quite important, and it's one that, as a government, we're committed to moving forward on. With respect to C-53, it was legislation that was co-developed by the Métis nations of Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Extensive work and consultation went before the bill was actually presented to Parliament. The decision by the Alberta courts with respect to the Fort Mackay Métis, as well as the Métis Settlement General Council, has given us a moment to pause. At the same time, with the decision of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, we are reflecting on what the next steps are in this process, and we're in constant engagement with both the Métis Nation of Ontario and Alberta to see how we move forward, and I will be glad to report back to the committee as we progress on this.
Thank you.
You spoke in your opening remarks, Minister, about the increase in spending in the estimates, and I would note that there has been lots of spending through your department as well as Indigenous Services Canada, and I certainly take no issue with that on the face of it. However, I want to turn your attention to a PBO report, research and comparative analysis of CERNAC and ISC, and it has found that both your department and Indigenous Services, despite this dramatic increase in funding, it has not led to an equal increase in the results, in the ability of your department to reach its goals. So maybe just to start with that, Minister, is that report concerning to you?
Look, we are about obtaining results, right? And I think in terms of closing the gap, if we look at closing the gap as probably one of the major goals of the work of our government collectively, whether it's ISC or us, it is what we want to achieve. It is closing the gap on education, on child welfare, on outcomes. But the work that...
But specifically, Minister, could I ask, is it concerning to you to see the report that despite the spending, it is not leading to that increase in the ability for you and your department to achieve its results?
Well, I think there's
I would hope it would be concerning to you.
There's some explanations on that, right? Because it's not simply, for me to say it's concerning or not. I think if you need to look deeper into the work that we do. So if you look at, correcting or redressing past harms, we have substantial expenses. Agriculture benefits in last year, we concluded 9 of them, just under $1 billion, primarily in the prairies, that are part of failures of governments on respecting cows and plows commitments. Robinson Huron is a settlement, unprecedented settlement of $5 billion from the federal government and another $5 billion from the provincial government. Now, those are not necessarily about closing the gap. Those are about redressing past wrongs. So a lot of the work that CERNAC does is about redressing past harms, and unfortunately,
thank you, Minister. And I don't mean to cut you off, but sure. I'm sure you heard I have quite limited time on this. So, Minister, given what we know, and I appreciate your answer, but given what we know that the spending is not going where it needs to go, can you name one or two examples, some tangible steps you've taken since you've become the minister to address this, to ensure that the dollars that are flowing from your department are actually going to the nations and the programs that are relying on it?
Look, to be very clear, there are a number of outstanding cases that come in front of me, whether it's through the specific claims process or through litigation, where there needs to be a response. Now, they're not going to any of those expenses are going towards.
Have you taken one concrete measure since this report came out to address the gaps that are highlighted in that report?
We are working, for example, on the spending review. We ensure that the spending review does not impact programs. It impacts administrative costs. It impacts travel, for example. But we made sure that it doesn't directly impact any of the program expenses that are outlined as part of our programs.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, according to the Yellowhead Institute, 0 calls to action were completed in 2023 for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. 8 years since the release of the 94 calls to action, 81 remain unfulfilled. According to the report, and I quote, most of the calls to action remain incomplete as bureaucratic roadblocks, endless debate, and nearly every excuse imaginable delay progress. Minister, what concrete steps have you been taking in your ministry to speed this up? It's even quoted former Minister Mark Miller as saying the biggest challenges and fights have been within their own institutional mechanisms.
Thank you, Jamie. I think I answered much of the question with respect to TRC calls to action earlier, but let me just, add again. Let's just, add to what I said earlier. The work that we're doing in terms of the calls to action are critical, but they're not linear, check marks that we could do at the end of the day.
I would rather lean into more what's being done. Because if your former minister is saying the problems within the department, I'd kind of like to know what's going to be done to speed this up. It's 0 completed last year, according to the Yellowhead Institute.
Well, we can go through the number of, things that we've completed this year, right, including the national, the work around the National Council for Truth and Reconciliation, the work around UNDA. These are advances that we're doing. From a leadership perspective, I do want to say that Valerie Gideon is our new deputy minister. She brings with it a vision.
If it's been 8 years, 81 remain unfulfilled, 0 completed last year. Are we doubling our efforts here? As Mr. Melillo just talked about, spending is up, results are down. What are we doing differently?
I think, to be very clear, 81 remains unfulfilled means that many of them are in progress, right? So I give you an example of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We called for an inquiry in 2017. The report of the inquiry was delivered to us 5 years ago, June the 3rd. There are 231 calls to justice that we're in the process of implementing. Now, if you suggest that we can do that in 8 years, I think we would not be doing it properly. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's an act that came into force in 2021. Again, we tried to bring it in 2019. Unfortunately, it was stalled in the Senate because
okay, Minister,
that some of your colleagues in the Senate didn't support it.
And I really want to get to another one. We talked earlier about safeguards to ensure that fraud for non-Indigenous people trying to get money that they aren't entitled to. You said earlier we can talk about another settlement. So let's talk about the 60s scoop settlement that was created. So according to the website here, total claims received almost 35,000. There were denied claims almost 14,000. So clearly, I'm guessing there were some. I've been reading here, there were some safeguards in place. So given that there were potential safeguards in place to ensure that the money actually went to the victims, and appropriately so, you're telling me you didn't share information, your department didn't share information to Indigenous services to ensure that the child welfare settlement isn't going to be properly allocated? Like, there must have been some communication here.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Valerie to address this question.
Yes, thank you. So I can assure you that with respect to the compensation agreement, which of course is under the responsibility of Minister Handu, that it is a First Nations-led process, and that they will be really driving the compensation process in terms of its design and its delivery.
According to the information we have here, it's being managed by Deloitte.
So that is a third-party claims processor,
right? So
which again, Minister Hadju can speak to, but it was selected and the oversight will be through the First Nations parties process.
But through the administrator
Mr. Snell,
as well.
I'm afraid that's the end of the time. So I'll have to wait to at another time, but thank you very much. And our
former chair would have given you more time.
I already gave you a little bit of extra time, but
You can also ask me a question in the House, Jamie.
But with that, I want to turn it over to our last round of questions to Mr. Cart for 3.5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Minister, I'd like to ask you a more open-ended question. I know we have a new, more progressive government in my home province of Manitoba that has been working quite collaboratively with our government on a variety of files, but perhaps none more important than that with which you are preoccupied, and of course, and extending to Ministers Vandal and Haidu as well. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that has developed between yourself, your department, and your counterparts in Manitoba as we work collectively to improve the livelihoods of Indigenous people in my home province of Manitoba?
Thank you, Ben, and I really do appreciate the question. Province of Manitoba, under the premiership of Wab Kinew, has become a remarkable partner for us. There's been a number of major things that we've been working on, and I think the Prairie Green landfill is probably one of the most profound issues and one of the most difficult issues that I've had to deal with. And as we, look at the families who are impacted and the young people that have been advocating for search, Premier Kinew has been a good partner, and we're working with him as well as Minister Fontaine towards the search, and it's something that we both committed to. Recently, we announced the pilot of the Red Dress Alert, which was, again, one of the budget items in 2024. And Manitoba, just given the history, just given that Manitoba is one of the epicenters of this crisis, is the appropriate partner to be piloting a Red Dress Alert on the work that we're doing towards Red Dress implementation. Last February, as part of the work around MMIWG, we had the second Indigenous provincial federal territorial meeting on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals, and Mr. Fontaine was one of the co-chairs. So we believe that we have very important partnerships. Look, in many cases, without the provinces being an essential partner, we cannot move forward. And I give you the example of the Robinson-Huron settlement with the province of Ontario. We have some very important work that we're doing with the province of British Columbia, some of the territories, including Yukon and Nunavut, as well as Northwest Territories. Federal government cannot do it alone, and it does require essential partners in our provincial territorial bodies that can rise to the occasion, and I believe that Manitoba is in that state right now.
Thanks very much, Minister. I do appreciate your leadership on this file, as well as that of Ministers Haidu and Vandal. I know when I speak with colleagues in Manitoba that there is a noticeable change in the relationship and the desire to accomplish things on behalf of Manitobans, inclusive of Indigenous communities, of course. Mr. Chair, if I do have any time left, I'll cede it back to the committee. Thank you.